Well, hello, everybody. We're going to wait a second for people to join us, but we're so excited to have you here today. I'm Lori Rudiman, your air traffic controller, your MC for this entire day. And it's really been my pleasure to work with BetterWorks, to partner with them, and to really bring you the great content here at Empower HR. And while you're settling in and getting ready to see Jenn Lim, don't forget that we have a place for you to chat, a place for you to ask questions. And I just want to give a shout out to three people who are special to my heart. The first is Chris, who's in Charlotte. And Chris, I know you appreciate this great weather we're having. Spring has been iffy and weird here this year. So Chris, it's good. Find me on LinkedIn and let's make sure we connect. When I drive over to Charlotte, I can say hello. The next person I wanted to say hi to is Mia B in Barcelona. And boy, don't I wish I were in Barcelona today. What a great city. Gaudi Cathedral is starting to come along, right? We're starting to wrap that up. So pretty excited about that. And Barcelona is one of my top 3 cities in the world. And then finally, we have Lindsay in Chicago. And I grew up in the city of Chicago for my first 16 years before coming down here to North Carolina. I lived in a place called Albany Park. So, Lindsay, find me, please, on LinkedIn. And maybe we can, talk some smack about Chicago because there are some things to be said about that, including the fact that you're going to get snow in the next couple of days again. So, crazy, crazy weather in Chicago. And y'all, I'm so glad you're here today because we're going to get started with our keynote speaker, Jenn Lim. And she is the founder and best-selling author of Beyond Happiness and the CEO of Delivering Happiness. And it's a company that she and Tony Hsieh created as like an outgrowth of Zappos. And she's going to tell you that story and really discuss what it takes to build a radical, empathetic culture within your organization that focuses on fixing work and creating great work experiences by focusing on yourself first. So, without further ado, I'm excited to introduce Jenn. Jenn, are you here?
I am here. Can you hear me okay?
Absolutely. I'm going to say goodbye and I'll see you at the end of the session.
Awesome. Thank you, Lori. All right. So I think I'm hearing a little chatter that there's an echo. Hopefully this is coming in a little better, but let us know if you have any difficulties. So yeah, I'm so excited to be here. I'm actually piping in from Seoul, Korea. It's 1:23 a.m. and this is a little just FYI fun fact if you ever come to Korea. I ordered a pot of coffee like an hour ago preparing for this event and then they gave me this. So just FYI, their pot is pretty much like a cup of coffee. Next time you're here. But anyway, I'm so excited because when I had this pre-event call with Empower HR and the folks that are behind this, I was just so pumped up because it just seemed like they were totally on top of what they want out of this whole event. And in terms of the bigger scheme of things and how we are thinking and rethinking what HR actually means. So along the lines of empowering HR, what does that mean? It really is empowering us, and not in those huge like transformation type words, but like empowering us ourselves on a day-to-day basis incrementally. So what's really cool, and I'm sure you all know this, I know some of this will be preaching to the choir, is how the roles of leadership in HR with CHROs, CPOs has changed so much, especially now. And the fact that it's going from, HR is bringing a human back into HR, human resource. It means we're a strategic partner, not just about compliance and legal. All these transformation changes in the world and how we work is leading to these changes within us and how we actually own up to this crazy cool role that we have. And the irony of this, if I've just observed, is that somehow everyone kind of thinks they know how to do HR stuff, like they can do your job. But the irony is that they're not doing it. And the reason why is because, well, at least I believe, It's because it's freaking hard. It's hard to do what you all do and actually make it work. So, what I think is really cool about this current time, even though there's so much changes and there's a lot of things that we have to adapt to, it's time for, I believe, HR leaders to really own the role with confidence and a sense of like, look, transparency of, look, we don't have all the answers, but we're going to try this out. And anyone that says different, that like they know what they're doing, clearly has to have a reality check and self awareness because no one knows exactly what they're doing. But what we can do is come up with new things to try, test it out, and then kind of rinse, wash, repeat. So anyway, I'm just going to dive into. I just want to say thank you for having me and the team. Super excited to share my learnings and hear from you. So, how I love to start this off is a simple question: where were you in 2020 BC? And of course, I don't mean that in biblical terms. I mean that before COVID. But if you were alive back then, I'd love to hear your skin regimen. Um, what's crazy about to happen in 2020 BC is that, futurists actually predicted all these different things of pandemic, recession, climate change, social inequality, disruptive technology, so on and so forth. But what they did not predict is that it was going to happen in the same freaking year. So with that, it was just a huge reminder that the whole world, it can just actually close down at one time. And with that, it actually gave us a bigger reminder of how the rate of change and complexity was already going fast. But with that, it's actually increasing our inability as human beings to actually understand it. And just to give you an example about the rate of change, like the good old telephone took 75 years to reach 50 million people. And if you're to guess what only took 19 days to reach the same amount of people, throw whatever out there, your guess is actually Pokemon Go. And then more recently, though, what took just 60 days to reach 100 million people? If you were to guess, I'm sure some of you thinking this already, it was ChatGPT. So, just indicators of how things are moving so quickly, and then therefore, what are we going to do as leaders in our own right to make adaptable change and make it stick? So, going out to 2020 BC, there were so many work changes beyond our control. As we all remember, closets became our conference rooms, and we just had really hard choices that we never had to make before. Things like whether or not we wake up a little bit earlier so that I can get on video, or just keep it audio only because it's 5 o'clock somewhere. So for me, I remember when 2020 came, clock hit midnight, and I was just so excited. I was like, oh my gosh, we're living in the future now. And then, of course, COVID came, and then I kind of got hit with other things like more gray hair and more wrinkles, so on and so forth. But one thing I think we did all gain is a bit of wisdom. So now, where are we with this great reset? Great, a lot of things, right? It's so interesting to see how that the work life separation or balance is more integrated than ever. People are making hard choices 3 years after this. We've heard it all from every, new term that comes up every other week: great resignation, great reset, great reshuffle, quiet quitting, quiet promoting. I can go on and on and on. But I think we can all recognize all these new trends are all indicative of a very similar thing systemically, that something is not working in the way we work. So, according to McKinsey, why are people quitting? Top 3 reasons: I don't feel cared for by my manager, I don't feel cared for by my organization, and I simply just don't feel like I belong. So, what's interesting though is the reminder of this. In the latest stats, according to MIT Sloan, the top predictor of this turnover is going back to this toxic corporate culture. And it's the first time in history that it's more likely the cause over comp or pay. But on the bright side, if you do have a strongly, engaged culture, then the likelihood for you is to actually sustain over time. So we think about this great resignation, and what's on the other side of that spectrum is what some people are calling the great awakening. In that sense, that people have taken time to actually reflect and understanding, wait, what am I doing and how am I spending the time of my day from the time I wake up to the time I go to sleep? Am I doing the right things? Am I prioritizing the right way? Am I treating the right people in the way that's most meaningful to me and therefore with the greatest impact? So what's been interesting to me, I've been in the happiness space for a long time. I started hearing more and more over the years, the last 3 years, how can I get back to my happy place? And what does that actually mean? So when I say happy place, it's not like when you're in a fight or flight mode trying to get out of your situation to be happy again. And I'm not talking about this form of happiness either, although it is one form of happiness, a pleasure one. This is actually a picture from my house during COVID, and I can attest I did test this out, and somehow I think it's kind of true. But the kind of happiness I'm talking about, just to be very clear, is the stuff, the data, the academics of what makes scientific happiness. What is positive psychology? And for me, how that applies to work and life. So when I talk about happiness, I talk about when you feel authentically true to yourself, when you feel like you have a compass, you have a North Star, and you're able to be living that life on a day to day basis, a higher purpose, if you will. You feel like technology is not tethering you because you're tethering technology because you know what it's used for and useful to you. You feel resilient. You feel you're able to get through those ups and downs. And of course, you feel like you're spending time with the people that you love the most. And just a pro tip on presentation, if you ever get a chance to put an image of a toddler and a pet, I highly recommend it. So, fast forward where we are now. Where are you now in 2023 AC? And so thinking about, a few months ago, I can't believe it's already April, we were kind of opening the door, still a little trepidatious, not knowing what's going to be behind it. And lo and behold, there were still more headlines that remind us we are in still a state of all time high volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity. News about continuing news about the war, the earthquake in Turkey, inflation, rolling recession. You know what I'm saying? And the result for us as human beings is that it's causing this FUD factor of fear, uncertainty, and doubt. What I think is interesting, though, is that it really was just amplifying all these things that were already there. Like, especially in this space, we've already heard about high turnover, disengagement, burnout, things about mental health. But I think with 2020, it just blew the hood open so that everyone could see and all was laid to bear. And finally, we're at a point where we can actually have a discussion about these things in more transparent ways. To the point where the Surgeon General actually put this, like, launched this a few months ago and saying, look, mental health, basically they're putting like a warning label like on cigarettes, but they're putting it on workplaces that this is impacting our the American people in these big ways as a factor of what it means to be working and how it how it really changes our health. So this one is a big one in terms of what's happening now, burnout. And this is the number one thing that's plaguing the global workforce, according to Gallup. And so, what do we see? How does that happen when we have a huge workload, lack of control, lack of recognition, bad relationships? We don't feel like we're being fairly treated. And what's really interesting, too, especially for this audience, is that when you have burnout is one thing, but as leaders in our space, we actually internalize other people's burnout as well. So, we're going to actually hit our first poll. I'm just really curious to hear from you. How many feel like you're internalizing burnout today? So A is definitely yes. B, no, I'm doing okay. And C, I'm not sure. So this is the first time I'm using this poll platform. So I'm just leave it for a little bit. We're getting, all right, we got some people submitting now. Awesome. Cool. All right. Yes, over half of you, definitely yes. Internalizing burnout. 30 are doing all right, and 12% are not so sure. So, just as a reminder, like those that are internalizing burnout, you're probably internalizing others as well. And that level and that awareness of boundaries is just such a huge point of all this that I'm about to share. So, what's not surprising is that workplace well-being levels still at an all-time low with high stress and anxiety in a way that our mental and physical state in many ways have not been actually acknowledged and or processed in a way that we can all say, hey, we understand what happened in the last few years to bring us to where we are today. So what's interesting about this is that the difference between what happened in the Great Depression and all that stuff and now historically is that we have more wherewithal. We have more knowledge of what the difference is in being able to adapt. And that essentially is a function of both our mentality and our physical health. So even though this rate of adaptation and the rate of change is like growing exponential, we have at least more knowledge, at least more awareness, and more tools to be able to say if we can ground ourselves as human beings, as people at work, psychosomatically in our well being, then we can actually weather and adapt to these changes better than before. So, with that, like what's really cool now, back in the day, even just I would say 10, 15 years ago, four-letter words like love and hate, we couldn't use too much in the workplace. But now we have this opportunity to be actually more respected by talking about these things and operating from both the head and the heart in a way that makes sense for people while being very empathetic to where they're at. So I just want to really quick go through my 2020 BC backstory. I was a consultant at Zappos back in the day, and helped Tony Hsieh launch a book called Delivering Happiness back in 2010. At the time, they got acquired by Amazon, and lo and behold, there was a demand for happiness in the world. So decided to create a company and help other organizations figure out how this equation simply works. If you have happier employees, you have happier customers, and you'll have a more profitable and sustainable business. And most importantly, you're creating more meaningful lives. So that was a huge, like, I was in disbelief of how successful it became. Inc. 5000, we were global. Things were exciting, but of course, what happens when the inconceivable happens? And I'm sure some of you out there probably know every line of this movie still. The inconceivable happened to everyone in the last few years, some form of it. And I realized some truth. As I was working on this next book, Beyond Happiness, back in 2020, I was realizing how everyone around us has experienced some form of trauma, some form of loss. And when I say loss, it doesn't necessarily have to be a friend or a person. It can also be a loss of hope or expectation, a loss of a job, a loss of, a relationship, what have you. And so with that mindset, it was this reminder. It's like everyone you meet that you know or don't know is fighting a battle you know nothing about. And this quote says be kind, but I believe like let's just be human. And how does that come into play in our life and work? And so the question for me becomes how have we processed all of this and what do we think, feel, and do about it now? And so what's been interesting in these last few years, we had this exercise for a long time now, like over 10 years, called the Happiness Heartbeats. Revisiting this exercise has been really interesting because people wanted to understand what happiness really means to them again. So by revisiting this exercise, and I'll just give you a demonstration here, what the happiness and values mean to you are in not just your highs in life, but also your lows. And this has been really instrumental in helping people align, teams and organizations align, like what does real happiness, meaningful happiness mean to you? So quickly, how to do this. So you go through you're the star of your own show, protagonist of your own movie, and you think about all your highs and lows in life. Could be professional, could be, I think it should be both, work and life. So for me, my high was getting into Berkeley. I'm Asian American. So I was successful in my parents' eyes because I got into Cal, I was studying pre-med, and I had several years of piano under my belt. But I realized it wasn't for me, and I told them like, I can't do this. I gotta go major in something else, and it ended up being Asian American Studies. And of course, I freaked them out, and they said, Asian American Studies, come home more often. We'll tell you what your Asian American life is all about. But anyways, that was one of my highs, lows. I got spit out, .com baby, got this job at KPMG, and I got laid off. And I felt totally like my life was out of control. And then 9/11 happened. And then yet one of the lowest lows of my life, my dad was diagnosed with stage 3 colon cancer. And I lost him not too long thereafter. Then going back to the high again, that's when Delivering Happiness was born as a company. I became the CEO, one of like those dreams that I had no idea I wanted, but it was living a purposeful life. But then fast forward, had to reorg, one of the hardest times, became public enemy. We all know how hard it is to have a reorganization, but then back to another high, Inc. 5000, awesome, amazing. You're getting what I'm like saying right now. I think you're picking up what I'm putting down. These highs and lows in our life. And then ultimately I had this last low in 2020 where I lost my co-founder and one of my best buds, Tony. So in this low, in this newfound low, and again, everyone has one form or another during these last 3 years. It was such an interesting time that I had no idea how low I could go. And being in the happiness space, I actually had to ask myself, did all of this that I've been doing actually make sense? Does it still hold true? And that's when it dawned on me that it was more true than ever. How the highs and lows, the loss and life, it's really about those heartbeats and actually understanding and embracing them and realizing that we're going to eventually lose the people we love, we're going to lose ourselves. So with this sense that this is a life of impermanence, what can we do differently other than just ground ourselves in the things that mean the most? And that's within. So for me, I was writing this book, it was 2020, all these crazy things were happening, and I came across this quote: death is not the greatest loss in life, the greatest loss is what dies inside while we're still alive, by Norman Cousins. And as I was doing more research, I was realizing, wait a second, like there was other people that were saying the same thing around the world. Tupac and Buddha said the same thing in their own words. And then I got super excited because I was like, I cannot wait to put a slide together so I can have Norman Cousins, Tupac, and Buddha all in one slide. But to me, it was the universality of all this. It's like we are connected human beings, and how we are is one example of this. When you think about one of your highs, when you think about one of your lows, and you think about what is the outcome of that, because it really is about the reaction. Everyone has all these things that comes out to that they have to overcome or deal with. What is our reaction? So the difference is that if we can actually take it in as a form of growth versus a form of stress, it's not to say we can erase all this trauma and loss, but we can make the choice to reduce that kind of impact it has on us for the rest of our lives. And then it actually empowers us, knowing when we look back at those lows that we had in the past and we hit another one in our future, at least we know ourselves, not through some inspirational quote, not through some self help book, but through our own experience, how to get through it and to the next high. And that's how I came to Beyond Happiness, in the sense of not just rainbows and unicorns, is how we live fully. Because if you think about it, from the time you wake up to the time you go to sleep, it's just not realistic to be happy the whole time. But you can live fully, and you can live with those highs and lows in a way that it carries over and forward to a more meaningful life. So by being real and by embracing our whole selves and really creating the environment for people to have, I know you've heard this term over and over again, psychological safety is like the number one thing right now, where people can be themselves in their strengths and shadows, in their bright and blind spots, and be able to create that environment where people can actually understand with psychological safety that as leaders, we naturally want to help others. But one thing I forgot, and one thing that was missing from the equation, because Tony and I used to talk about being greenhouse leaders, like creating the conditions so people can grow, which was totally on point. But what was missing from that equation is how much we have to nurture our own greenhouse so that we can grow them better for others. And I know it's not easy. Like everyone's busy. I don't know if everyone remembers this movie, but it's probably 30 plus years now. But it's really, that's so relevant still because we're just too busy. Like, how can we have time for this? And we already have so many jobs and so many hats that we have to wear. And it just feels like it's unachievable because we have this rock that we have to keep on pushing. But the the interesting irony for me is that when we see this on our cell phone, we know instinctively to do. We know we got to charge that thing. But why is it that we're just so bad at recharging our own battery? So if we don't let it happen to this, how come we're letting it happen to our own bodies? And how can we be better at reminding ourselves? Of course, the question is how the insert your expletive here do that. So I'm going to go over some of the nuts and bolts of what I share in the book, and the greenhouse model is what I call it. And so there's the pyramid of what, the circles of who, and together they make up the how. So on the base of the pyramid is values and behaviors, and I have an example of some values there for a company. But essentially, like, what are your values? Great, a lot of companies have them, but what are your specific behaviors that are actually defined in black and white from those values? Are they lived daily? And of course, are they rewarded and recognized and incentivized? Because otherwise, then there is no sort of baseline as to how people will know how you would like those values and behaviors to be lived on a day-to-day basis. So what happens when they're not in place? We've seen it time and time again. We heard it. Remember back in the day of Enron, their number one value was integrity. That was a very different dictionary from the rest of the world. And then fast forward to now, where we had WeWork and we had Theranos. And what was so interesting about these companies is that they were so purpose driven, yet somehow there was a values misalignment. So this is happening all around us in some form or another. But we as leaders can recognize that if we get those values and behaviors aligned, we get a sense of making sure people feel they have autonomy, they feel aligned, they feel they have accountability, not in a bad way, but they feel like they're working in teams and they got each other's back with real relationships. And that's how we've seen the most adaptable teams actually be able to adapt and get and progress in this very rapidly changing world. So next on the model is the higher purpose piece. And this one we hear more and more about, like, what is it? What is this purpose thing and how do we put it into play? The biggest factor that's happening now is that if we can define our purpose, not just from an organizational standpoint, but also from a team standpoint and the personal individual standpoint, create environments where we're actually asking people to define their purpose outside of work. It doesn't really matter, just as long as they get a sense of like, hey, I actually care about what I want and what my higher purpose might be. And when you get that alignment from a personal to the higher team and organization, that's when you see true alignment. And the great thing about purpose is that Great Place to Work last year said those people, companies that have purpose, 3 times more likely for higher retention. And when you have purpose, with all these changes around it, it's okay because we're better equipped to expect and embrace the changes that can happen in this very, very, very unpredictable world. So, what are some quick examples of what purpose looks like when it's really working well? Poster child of purpose, of course, you all know this one, Patagonia. I love what the founder said a few months ago. He said, instead of going public, we're going purpose, and our main shareholder is Earth. And they've been so consistent in that, in their values and behaviors. Another great example, Airbnb. Like, they were hit so hard during COVID, as we all know, couldn't travel, couldn't fly, yet they stuck to their grounds and stuck to their guns of being grounded in, hey, we believe and we belong. And now they are, I think they had one of the most profitable quarters and so well positioned to continue to adapt and thrive in this uh, changing environment. So moving to the middle of the pyramid, there's the greenhouse conditions, and it goes more in detail in the book. But I think the best sort of metaphor I have for to describe this is like, what are the conditions to create others to grow in your greenhouse? And so I love talking about nature because I learned so much from it. Sequoias. I don't know if y'all have been Northern California. That's where I'm from. But if you've walked around like this majestic place of trees, tallest in the world. But what's so interesting is that they have the shortest root structure of all the trees. And the reason why they're able to actually adapt and thrive is because the root structure is all interconnected underneath. And they even did experiments. The scientists were putting dye, like a colored dye, in one end of the forest to see where dye would go. And a few years later, they found that colored dye on the other end of the forest. My hope is that it was organic dye because that would really suck for the trees. But point being, because each of these trees stand on their own with their own DNA, but because they're so interconnected with this sense of having a shared higher purpose and a sense of belonging, they are able to adapt and thrive. So going over to the who, and this one is the me, we community model. Simply that these three things are really what interconnects us all. And what we believe, or what I believe, is that we start with the me. And this one's super important because if you think about everyone in your organization, how can we start with the me? Asking this question, are you okay? I think LinkedIn started using this and adding this into their employee surveys and making sure you have that psychological safety. If you heard this study before, Google did a really cool study about what the most efficient teams are in their organization. And it wasn't about having the best software, it wasn't about having the best manager. It's called the Aristotle study. It was about having the most psychological safety in the teams. So this question is so important to share, not just with each other, but to ourselves. Because now more than ever, people need to know it's okay not to be okay. And therefore, like, how do we actually interact in that? By painting this picture that this is a spectrum. We can be flourishing on one end, or we can be languishing, kind of meh, kind of like maybe not necessarily depressed all the time, but not really fully energetically there. And being able to say that's okay, because showing up doesn't mean we're just like full throttle every day. That's just not how it works. And being understanding that what it actually means is some days we'll have great days and some days we won't. And how can we actually embrace that in a way that is, taking all the negativity out of quiet quitting or bare minimum Mondays, but really treating people from a positive side of their whole self, their whole authentic self. So it's not just well-being anymore, it's whole being. And how do we do that as leaders? I have this tool in or exercise in the book, but basically making sure that these tools that we're using, the data we're collecting, is not just asking about their skill set or their progress in their role, but asking their whole self, financially, emotionally, mentally, relationally, spiritually, or purposefully. All these things getting captured on a consistent basis can paint a really good picture as to how we have these conversations so that people feel like they're being heard and understood with psychological safety. So one thing I present is like thinking about, like, we know what it means to invest in, some sort of fund financially. Why don't we invest in our own fund, the Me Greenhouse Fund? There's a lot of talk about self-care, self-compassion, self-development. This is the time that we can actually encourage it in a way that we know that once people found the value in it, because one person's massage is different from one's meditation or a walk in the park. The goal here is to encourage people to test what it is that really actually impacts them in a positive way. And then they will actually want to invest in that fund for themselves. And one thing about this is it's like such a big cycle. It's such a big process. It's not just like a one hit wonder. We learn something, we forget it, we practice it again, and we forget it. And then we really learn it until it becomes, as we know, from behaviors to habits. And so the reminder here is for all these, people that might be, whether they're aware of they're struggling or not, that it's okay. Even though it feels like we're just kind of going circles, what actually is happening is this sort of staircase, spiral staircase going up with progress along the way. And there's a reminder of the difference of starting when we're ready or just starting today and being able to look back, like the heartbeats exercise, on how much progress has been made. So, on to the next poll. Who wants, given all this, who wants to start investing in your own greenhouse fund or maybe helping others in investing in their own greenhouse fund as well? So A is yes, I already am in your own way, which is awesome. B, yes, but I don't know where to start. C, no, I don't have the time. And D, I'm not sure. Let's give you a little time to respond. Mm-mm-mm. Cool. And what do we got here? Oh, that's pretty awesome. A third of you are already on in your own ways. Nice. And then, what's so cool about that is like you're able to be more like that much better equipped to do that for others. So I love that. About half of you says yes, but don't know where to start. Hopefully after this, you'll have some idea just to start. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it could be this trial of what that fun can be. Test new things out for yourself. I swear, like even the smallest thing, like when I feel stressed out, I just break out my iPhone and you have the photos app, the moments, and I start playing some of those videos of like these random stuff that happened in the past, and all of a sudden I just feel like, oh, okay, I can breathe a little bit better. But anyway, it's really about testing, rinse, wash and repeat. Okay, so we went from the me to the we. The we greenhouse is so important for us in the way we look at people because we know they're not expenses. We know that they're assets. We have the data. Best place to work, Glassdoor, best companies to work for Fortune, consistently over the last 10, 15 years outperformed the S&P 500. So we know the data is there. So we can talk to any CFO and be able to say, look, we know this works. The one big thing about this, though, that's different from 2020 BC is this idea of how we can do it together and the sense of belonging. Because it's, as we all know, it's really possible to feel alone even when we have people around us. So, what might we do differently, especially with the EIB? And how do we go about it? So, I'm sure some people can empathize with this slide. Those having a onesie in your closet, a bear onesie like I do right now, is like, okay, how can we empathize with this and how can we frame DEIB in a positive way? So I think the biggest thing is to define it like happiness. I define it by having science behind it. It's about having a higher purpose, about being authentic. So I love this analogy for DEIB. Diversity is being asked to the dance. Inclusion is being asked to dance. Equity is having a turn to pick the DJ or play your own music. And belonging is just being able to dance however you want. So by defining exactly what we mean by it, then there is no gray area as to like what our initiatives are behind it. And then from an org design structural point of view, when you have the pieces that I shared earlier, the what, the who, and then the lens of DIB going through every single process that we go through in our organization, whether it's from org structure to hiring and firing to benefits and perks, what I'm saying? Like, then you know that there's systemic change that's happening when you have these foundational pillars in place. So one thing that I really want to remind is that when we have this sense of belonging, that's when these ideas of what real change could be. When we're talking about remote versus hybrid versus, how many days in and out, all this stuff is like, we don't know until we ask. So we listen attentively and then we do what's best also for the organization. And because no one knows all the answers, all we can do is ask the right questions and listen with that psychological safety in place and keep on testing on what might work. All right, the last piece, community greenhouse. So we went to me, we, community. And the biggest premise of this is not just asking what's in it for me, it's asking what's in it for all as well. So that any question that we have that's being presented to us, if we ask and answer the me and for all, we know inherently that we were being considerate of not just like your own individual needs, but what's it also in for the team or the organization. And by doing this, what we've seen is this end effect of what I call the double ROI. So the traditional return on investment, I shared that earlier about the stats of what double down on people can do. And then the other ROI is the ripple of impact. And this ripple of impact is essentially if you have like a Patagonia or the Airbnb, when you have these people within your team's organization that are individually living out their purpose, then you know that ripples out to the team's purpose and then it ripples out to the organizational purpose. And this now more than ever is what this interconnection to not just the organization, but truly to our ecosystem. Everything we touch, all our customers, suppliers, vendors, even the earth itself, even society itself, there's so much interconnection going on. And what I love, again, I'm really inspired by nature. And if you're a fan of Sir David Attenborough, if you've watched any nature shows on Netflix, or if you're a fan of, I don't know, marijuana or something, I'm sure you've heard his voice before. But basically, he's 90 something years old, and he's done his life's work on being able to say, look, the most biodiverse environments where you have the most flora, the most fauna, in those ecosystems are the most sustainable, most resourceful, resilient, and adaptable. And isn't that the most ideal environment for us as workplaces? So just thinking about if we can make sure that diversity is there within our environments, we will have all these different outcomes of that we all desire to make sure that we adapt and sustain. So I'm going to share a story about what I've learned since 2020 BC of workplace environments today. And I had picked the place that I thought had the least amount of control, had the most chaos at a time when there was very little information during COVID. And that was in a hospital system. And this was Northwell Health in New York, about 85,000 employees. And they're literally, hospital systems were in war zones. They just had no idea what's going on, high level of uncertainty, no control, and literally facing life and death decisions on a day-to-day basis. But here we have Northwell Health. They, during COVID, rose from number 93, best place to work, to number 19 during a pandemic across all industries. And I just was floored. I was like, what did you do to make that happen? And so I talked to Sven, the chief experience officer, and he just kind of went back into this time, a few years before COVID. They wanted to do a culture transformation. They started with people because they knew they wanted to impact their customers, their patients. They had to start with their own customers, which is their people. So they did this multi-year project. We had to align 300 executives. I mean, that's healthcare, right? But like, because they were so tenacious in making it work, when COVID rolled around and it happened and they tested themselves, are we going to walk the talk? And literally the CEO walked the talk. The leaders walked the talk. Like people told the CEO, do not leave this office. Do not leave this administrative office. We have no idea what this pandemic will do, what this virus will do. And he's like, no, I'm walking and I'm going to be there with my people. They set up tents outside so that employees could be hydrated, nourished, talk to therapists. They had peer-to-peer coaching. They celebrated their wins. So patients was celebrating alongside with the team that helped them out. And in these really, really hard, uncertain times, they were able to show how, again, by talking to the Sven, what he said, it's like, how'd you do it? We prioritize people and culture. It wasn't easy, but because we had those purpose and values and behaviors in place, we impacted our community in positive ways. So just to wrap this all up, if thinking through all these different concepts of what your greenhouse could be within yourself and for your teams and your companies, if you think about what it truly means to live fully in your highs and your lows, and how the pieces of this model might be applied to where you are at right now for this incremental change, I ask you to frame it like this. Like, what's the world you want to live in? Just take a moment to think about. What I've heard consistently is that, "Oh, I want a place where I could, be my best, where my people could be my best and grow. I want to be feeling authentic. I want to feel like I'm aligned. I feel a sense of belonging. I want to spend less time worrying, having more meaning in my life, in my days." By answering that question, sometimes it gets so heady and seems like it's such an impossible task, but I just love this Rumi inspired quote. Just remember, you're not a drop in the ocean. You are the entire ocean in a drop, in how we are just so interconnected. So, as reminders, be the leader of your work life, encourage your people to be so as well, ripple your impact from there. Be the archaeologist and the architect. Look and reflect and then design how you want your life to be lived on a day to day basis. So that ultimately, your legacy, when we think about legacy, I feel like it's about living it in the now, not later and not looking back after it's too late. So, with all that said, I'm just going to pause on this slide for a little bit because there's some free resources I'd love you to download if you're interested. There's some highlights of today's slides. There's a 30-day free program for PSS, we call it, but people strategy sessions. You talk to my team, just have any kind of questions you have. We're just here to help get through this period and get to the next of where we can actually feel a little more consistent, adapting and thriving. And then the last thing you can also get is a playbook. So sample exercises from what I shared today and others that I didn't have a chance to talk about as well. So with that, I think we're going to go Q&A now. And I guess after all that, if you remember anything out of this freaking presentation, just remember to please nurture your greenhouse, and so that we can do and grow better together. Thank you, everyone, for your time.
Thank you so much,
Thank
Jenn.
you.
That was so wonderful. Really appreciate you coming today to share your expertise and passion for reimagining the workplace and helping everybody. So that was so great to hear. So, hi everybody. I'm
Thank
Kate
you.
from the BetterWorks team. So we'll be kicking off our Q&A. So if you do have a question for Jenn but haven't popped it into the Q&A box down in the corner of your screen, please do so, and we'll do our best to get to them before our next session. I did see one come through in terms of the recording. So the recording will be available after the event. We will send that to all attendees by tomorrow. So thank you for that. Jenn, Michael had asked, could you give me a recommended book on what you presented today to help people down the greenhouse path?
Besides mine. Yeah. Oh gosh, it's so the greenhouse pad. I guess I think it depends on where you're at. Like this, what I tried to do in my book was just trying to frame, like, here's this model, and you can kind of pick and choose what pieces like are most relevant to you. So in some ways, depending on where you are in that path, like it's like a kind of almost like a different book to recommend. Um, I don't know if you're into this one, but the one that's on top of mind, because I was listening to it recently, is the New York Times bestseller, and it's called Lighter by Young Pueblo, Pueblo. And he just has a really simple but profound take on how to nurture your greenhouse. And it seems almost too simplistic at first, but it's a good reminder of where one can start in very practical ways. So that's the recommendation.
I love that. Thank you.
Yeah.
We also have a question where they ask any advice for young HR professionals about having your own greenhouse?
Any advice for young HR professionals? I would say I would say that this is actually a better time than ever to really be as authentic as you can. And this is not just for young young folks too. This applies across all generations, but it's just kind of like be bold and courageous with that authentic self and testing out what that can be. Because I think in hindsight, if I could talk to my younger self, I would be saying the same thing. So that would be my advice.
Cool. Thank you. And thank you for your question, Azilda.
Thank
Jessica
you.
is asking, we are looking to translate our strong company culture, BC before COVID, to the remote world and environment. So she asks thoughts on where to start with that.
Yeah. I kind of already said this, but it seems like, again, all overly simplistic. But I would say, whatever data and questions you're asking, make sure you're asking them in a deeper way, and like again with psychological safety, and make sure they feel heard. The biggest thing right now, like we've always known to do that as leaders in our space, um, but I think people are wanting it more. They just want real talk. They don't want any more of this BS that's been going on for a long time. And so the more real we are with them, the more we can get to the solutions. And the more we can ask across the board with that sense of belonging, the more we can have actually more data to say, okay, we have a great culture, but these are the things that we're being challenged by right now. What are your ideas? And so like having that more collaborative approach in a real talk way, just being like, not doing any rose colored glasses type thing. I think that would be a great place to start. And then maybe even also revisiting your values and behaviors and purpose, just to say, does this still hold true? And because you had that strong culture in the past, you have that backing to say, look, it worked back then, but it's a new world. So let's see what really sticks still today and what might not. So having those kind of honest conversations can lead to those things of saying, how should we do remote? How should we do hybrid? Because those are more detailed, like those are click downs. But I think you got to make sure that foundational piece of established trust and psychological safety needs to be there first.
I love that. Psychological safety is so important. And like you said, not dealing with the BS, but being honest about it too.
Yes.
Let's see.
Yes. In that
Elizabeth had
language.
asked, what experience have you had in helping CEOs embrace the concept of happiness in the workplace?
Well, it's been my life for the last 13 years. It's been really interesting because CEOs, they're all individual human beings, also going through their own take on what meaningful life should be and their interpretation of it. So what's interesting, since 2020, I feel like there's a big line in the sand drawn from those CEOs that wanted to step up and say, look, oh, wow, I have a bigger role than I thought, and there's more I can do. And then there was others that went to the other side, kind of regressed and got into a scarcity mindset and said, we got to go back to the old ways. So it's really interesting how this line keeps on getting deeper and deeper, because here we are, year 3, still having all this uncertainty with rolling recession and all that. So who's maintaining that scarcity mindset and who's expanding beyond it and trying to learn and grow in new ways? So I guess to answer your question, it's been, across the spectrum around the world of where these leaders are. And depending on where they're at is kind of where I meet them, with this whole notion of how can we just be more like, not just have a happier workplace, but how can we be more human to one another? Thank you for the question.
We have a lot are coming in. Gail had asked, how can we encourage people to share their lows without fear?
How can we encourage people to share lows without fear? Is that the question? Yeah, that's a good one. So from a practical way, so we talk about psychological safety a lot. One of the things that we do, so even if you don't have consistent values and behaviors in your company, you can create it in that space, create it in these meetings that you're having, to have sort of like what are the top 3 values that we're going to live by and that we all agree to in this space. So even if you don't have that safe space all the time, create it in a way that you're establishing a sense of trust and transparency. It really is, walking the talk. Once leaders can show by example how vulnerable they can be, and speak from the heart and speak for their truth, I mean, I think, people will join that in a way that they feel comfortable, and then they also feel heard. So yeah, that's been working out.
And Jenn, everybody's loved your presentation so much that a few people are asking, do you do in-person presentations? Do you offer presentations, excuse me, for companies? Where can they contact you?
Oh, thank you. Do I do it in person? No, I only do it from Korea at 2 a.m. in the morning. So, so if you want to do it in person, come here. It's fun. No, yeah, of course I do a presentation. I would love to, wherever you're at. This is what I love sharing and talking to people. So you just hit me up, email me, jen@deliveringhappiness.com. You can download those things and like take a look and just, yeah, come to my website, my URL, jennlim.com or deliveringhappiness.com, and just email me and we'll chat. Thank you for asking.
Well, hello to both of you. I'm sorry to interrupt the flow of this really great Q&A, but Jenn, what a tremendous keynote. Thank you so much for that. I'm glad you encourage people to go to jennlim.com or Delivering Happiness. The other thing people could do is go on Amazon and follow you as an author. I think that's another way they can support your work, learn about you, and learn about this happiness ecosystem that you've tried to create and done a really great job in doing. So thanks again for your time today.
Thank you, Lori. Thank you for being such an energy powerhouse too. And
well, I'm doing it in a pair of shorts and a blazer. So it's a real meta experience here. So listen, Jenn, thank you so much for your time. And listen, everybody else, I got a text message that there's some confusion on how to go from session to session. So if you'll just indulge me, I'm going to read from my phone. At the end of this session, when the screen shows the event has concluded, you can click on the red leave button on the top right, and then you'll be taken to the next session. You'll see the Join Now button. Click that and click play. And everybody, we're smarter than tech. We know what's up. We can figure this out. But you can stay within the On24 platform, but you're just going to leave and join the next session. And I'm going to find you there. It's a session on how Intuit, which is a perennial best place to work, made work better. So we're going to leave and we're going to join the next session, and I'll see you in a minute. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.